Hello and welcome to Slide Review. So today we are going back to Derm 2, which is our Dermatoses lecture that we gave last week, and we are going to go over the challenge cases since this was something that there was some expressed interest in. So as always, we have our disclaimer that goes up in the beginning. The only difference being that today it's just going to be me quickly going over these cases. But if you have questions about the disclaimer or anything else, please share them in the comments below. Or you can send me either DMs or posts on our Twitter as well, which are at the bottom left hand of the screen. So we're not going to actually spend time going over the lecture again since we've already done that, and there will also be a link to the original lecture in the description of this video as well. So we're just going to scroll down to our challenge cases and bring this back to full screen. So we have 18 cases we're going to go through, so we're going to go through them very quickly, try to hit the main points, and hopefully this is helpful. Again, challenge cases just really trying to give you a few more examples of some of these entities, because I feel like seeing more cases of them, seeing different varieties of these entities can be really helpful to learning more about them. So let's get started. Case 1, so what I'm seeing immediately is that there's something going on in the dermis. The epidermis itself looks acanthotic, and acanthosis again means thickened. So if we zoom in a little bit, we notice that the keratin layer seems okay. It doesn't seem like there's a lot going on there. We have this granular layer, which is this pigmented layer on the surface, and our basilar layer looks intact. So that's all good. There's nothing even at mid-power that looks atypical. What we do see is proliferation of all these vessels. So lots and lots of vessels. Many of them are dilated, so you can see that they're filled with red blood cells, and there's this pigment in here. So if we zoom in to look at the pigment, it's kind of more of a yellow-brown than a dark brown. So this is very likely hemosiderin, and it is within macrophages. And how do we know that they're macrophages? Well, they're relatively large cells. They have relatively regular nuclei, and the pigment is very spotty within them. It also has a different quality than what we normally see with melanin, but if you were concerned, you could either simply do like a Prussian blue or iron stain on this, which would be positive, and if you did like a melanase stain, that would be negative in these cells. So remember, melanocytes are a normal part of the epidermis, and this is not in this case, but if you had a nearby nevus, you can also have obviously a dermal component to nevi. So it would not be unusual to have some staining with melanase if you chose to go that route, but within these cells in particular, it would be negative, whereas your iron would be positive. Anyway, if we go back to low power a little bit, we do see that this is somewhat of a lobular configuration. There's not a lot of fibrosis going on here, but fibrosis is more of a chronic sign in these lesions. So what is this? This is stasis dermatitis, relatively nice example. And if we go to the smaller piece, which in all these cases I won't necessarily go to all pieces because we're just, again, trying to hit the major points, we again see this big lobular formation, maybe a little bit of increased fibrosis. But these aren't really truly inflammatory. They're very, very vascular lesions. So this is, again, stasis dermatitis. Case 2, we have our dermis. Sorry, our dermis is relatively bland looking at low power. And again, it seems to be that we have our superficial or papillary dermis seems to be the focal point. We have a little bit of acanthosis again. So if we zoom in, again, we see the keratin layer and granular layer all look fine. There is some acanthosis, intact basilar layer, and nothing else too remarkable going on in our epidermis. Again, the lesion is down here. We again see these dilated vessels, a little bit of increased fibrosis. This case isn't quite as prolific as the previous one, but this is yet another example of stasis dermatitis. So just kind of showing you a little bit of the variation that you can see. Again, maybe not as lobular. This looks a little more diffuse, but this is also stasis dermatitis. Case 3, what we notice immediately is this keratin layer is thickened, and we have this irregular acanthosis going on. These 3 pieces at low power look relatively similar, and these pieces are missing surface, so we're going to go to this piece. But again, doesn't matter too much. And what we see is we have a little bit of parakeratosis here and some orthokeratosis as well. So again, parakeratosis having the nuclei, orthokeratosis not. And we have our granular is there, but it seems like maybe it's diminished in some areas. It's kind of hard to tell. And we have these dilated vessels in our dermal papillae and spongiosis. Like this is pretty prominent spongiosis within our epidermis, and again, spongiosis being more of a reactive condition where we can see the spiny processes between the epidermal cells, but everything seems intact. It doesn't seem irregular. Like, yes, we have mitotic figures, but they are within the basal layer, or the basal 3 layers of cells. There's a little bit of fibrosis going on here. And again, because our previous cases of stasis dermatitis, we had more like the vascular proliferation. Here we have more of a fibrosis going on. There is inflammation within the dermis, which we did not see in the previous cases. So we have lymphocytes and plasma cells. Okay, so let's see. That's as far as I can zoom in on this case. What we can appreciate is the eccentric nucleus. Okay, so the nucleus is pushed off to the side with the cytoplasm on one end, so it kind of almost looks like a comet. I'm not sure how well you can make this out, but this does have clock face chromatin, which is, again, more readily appreciable if you can go to a higher power, but this is as high as we can go. But you can see how it's kind of a little clumpier on the outside, and that is that clock face chromatin. Again, if you were higher power, you'd be able to see the perinuclear Hoff, which is more of a clearing right around the nucleus that projects towards the cytoplasmic side. So that's a plasma cell. And there's actually quite a few of them in here. More than a few. But that's okay, because that's maybe something else going on besides this lesion. So having all these plasma cells, and some of them are maybe a little funny looking. Looks like the plasma cell as well. So that would be like a dermal plasmacytosis. And just having all the plasma cells, they're not forming a lesion themselves, so we're not worried about like, is this a plasmacytoma? There's just it's a very large sprinkling of plasma cells within the dermis. Okay, so that's dermal plasmacytosis. But the lesion itself, with all these fibrotic papillae and dilated vessels, and the acanthosis that's somewhat irregular, and the orthokeratosis, parakeratosis, this is lichen simplex chronicus with dermal plasmacytosis. Case 4, again, at low power, you don't want to necessarily spend too much time on a challenge case looking at this piece. These all look relatively similar at low power, so we're just going to go in, whoop, a little too much. And we can see again that there's this hyperkeratosis. Look at this extremely prominent granular layer, even though maybe in some areas it looks a little tangential. And again, these dilated vessels, the papillae themselves maybe not as prominent for the fibrosis that we saw. And this blue-gray that you see down here, this is actinic change, actinic damage, or solar elastosis, okay? So it has this blue-gray look to it, but it's kind of amorphous, okay? Kind of wispy in these areas, so it's not like not a sign of invasion, okay? This is due to actinic damage. Okay, so this is an area that's exposed to UV, and there's been changes within the dermal layer itself. So one of the things that I wanted to caution with this case is that you have areas like this where it looks like, you know, you could argue that, oh, is this epidermal plate thinning like we would expect to see in psoriasis, but it's not. It's just kind of compressed, kind of tangential. And again, the papillae maybe not as fibrotic as we would like, but this is another case of lichen simplex chronicus. And the inflammation within the dermis is also a lot lower. If I zoom in on that, so we can see it's a lot more lymphocytes. So we don't have that dermal plasmacytosis that the last case had, but this is again lichen simplex chronicus. And just to give you another look. These are the same cut, so you can envision that this is kind of the line between them. So I guess we'll look at these two over here. And what we notice is that there isn't any hyperkeratosis. There maybe is a little irregularity in the epidermal layer, like especially here. Even with this being tangential, if we imagine that it's cut at an angle, this still seems to be too much. And let's take a look closer. So what we see right away is that there is parakeratosis. And our granular layer is present, which is probably making this case extremely challenging. But again, you can imagine that the parakeratosis here is creating a mound, even though there isn't that cleft that we often see, and there is still a granular layer. These are things that are all allowed. There are increased melanocytes, but we don't know where the skin was taken. So again, it could have been taken either someone who has darker skin, or if we're looking at like areolar skin tends to be more pigmented. So there's lots of reasons for this, but these melanocytes all look very regular. Okay, there's nothing scary about this, so we're not worried that this is some sort of like melanoma or anything like that. One of the other things we see is that there is predominantly lymphocytic perivascular inflammation within the superficial dermis. See if we can find anything else. Thought I saw a couple of them before and I didn't point them out. That looks like an eosinophil. What you're looking for in this case, and again, pay attention, there is spongiosis, but that can be reactive as well as anything else, is we're looking for red cell extravasation. Well, there's some of it. Okay, so I'm buying this. So red cell extravasation can be within the superficial dermis as well as the epidermis. And not really appreciating a lot of like dyskeratotic cells, but you can see that in about half your cases. Okay, so what do we have here? So we have the mounded parakeratosis, and that I guess here maybe this is supposed to be a mound, and here's the cleft. Here's another mound. This looks better for a mound, even though it's not maybe the best example of parakeratosis since we have the nuclei down here, but we have this cleft. So what is this? This is pityriasis rosea. And yes, I'm well aware that I absolutely butchered the name during the live lecture, but this is pityriasis. So we go to the next case. Again, we see that these are the same cuts of the same tissue. So we're going to go up here. And we can see, again, there's this superficial dermal thing going on. So let's see what that is. A little bit of acanthosis again. Here's our parakeratosis. And this one does not have those increased melanocytes. So you can appreciate that everything is still in good order in this, and there's still that spongiosis, there's still that reactive change within the epidermis. Our superficial dermal layer is, again, predominantly lymphocytic. It's a lot more subtle than the previous case. And here's our solar elastosis again. So this was actually what we were seeing at low power. Do we have any extravasation? Let's try the other piece. Sometimes the piece that looks more interesting at low power is actually not the interesting piece at high power. So again, we start seeing the parakeratosis. Okay, well, there's one. That's an eosinophil. Okay, maybe there's a mound, and it is on the edge, but maybe we can envision that that would be a cleft. But this is by far a much more subtle example of, there's some more RBC extravasation, but this is a far more subtle example of pityriasis rosea. Okay, so moving on to the next case, what we see again is it looks like maybe there's some hyperkeratosis. This acanthosis looks fairly regular, even though we have the dermal papillae that you can see kind of poking up. And again, this is two sections of the same piece, so we're just going to look over here at maybe a mid-power. Okay, and what we see is, yes, there is acanthosis, looks relatively regular. We do have some inflammation, most likely, within the superficial dermis, and there's something going on in the keratin layer, so let's zoom in. And what these are is, these are microvesicles, a little bit of serum in there, some inflammation, and there is this very prominent spongiosis within the epidermal layer. That what we thought was inflammation at mid-power is inflammation. It's mostly lymphoplasmacytic. Maybe some red cell extravasation. But these microvesicles, acanthosis, and this mild superficial inflammation, because if we go into the deep dermis, we don't see any of that, right? This is relatively bland. Let's see if the other piece has anything else for us. And this looks very similar, very, very similar. Maybe some like dyskeratosis, which is okay. It's not really a feature of this, but there can be multiple things going on in skin. So what this is representing is eczema. So we have acanthosis spongiosis. We do have those microvesicles. This is an acanthotic lesion, or acanthotic eczematous lesion. So this is case 8. And again, we're not really appreciating any hyperkeratosis in this, but again, there is acanthosis. This is thickened. This one looks a little more irregular maybe, and there is also maybe some superficial dermal inflammation. Look at all those eosinophils though, wow. Lots of those. Again, acanthosis, we have the spongiosis again, like you can even see, like you can make out those spinous processes within this lesion. Lots and lots of eos, just look at that. Very reactive. So this is another example of eczema or eczema. But that spongiosis is just incredible. So there's not a lot of features that are super specific to eczema. So again, what you need is the clinical interpretation as well. So remember in the lecture, we had the photo of the child that had the perioral erythema. So again, these are really common to see, like within like the elbows or anywhere on the skin, but they're reactive. And remember that these patients will have chronic flares, so they need to try and keep the skin moist and avoid stressors that can cause them to have outbreaks of eczema. Case 9, again, we see this acanthosis. These dermal papillae that are really coming up, and some sort of hyperkeratosis. Okay, and what we see is that it's actually parakeratosis. You can make out those nuclei. And this is what's called confluent parakeratosis. So it goes all the way across, unlike our pityriasis where it was mounded. So some of you probably already know where we're going with this. We can see our intact basal layer. This is tangential. Okay, so these are papillae that are coming up. I suppose maybe here, but what we're looking for is that epidermal plate thinning. This is probably a better area. So you can see that really it's only a few cells thick. It's not super compressed. So that's epidermal thinning. We also have maybe not the best dilated vessels in the dermis. Like here's one. So this is definitely dilated. You can see that it's filled with red cells. And other features that we are looking for would be like red cell extravasation. So let's see if we can, there's some better dilatation. Okay, so there's some extravasation, even though that's maybe a little on the weak side. Let's see if this other piece maybe has more. You can see that there's lymphocytes. Do we have any neutrophils? Yeah, I think we have some neutrophils. Maybe. Neutrophils can sometimes be, I think, a little difficult to distinguish from lymphocytes, because lymphocytes will really distort themselves trying to squeeze in between those epidermal cells. This looks mostly lymphocytic, but I'll buy that as neutrophils. There's some neutrophils up in the epidermis. Okay, so we have this characteristic acanthosis, the thinning of the epidermal plate, even though it's maybe not as prominent as we see in some cases. We have our neutrophils, our dilated vessels, not a lot of inflammation, like maybe a little bit here where it's a little denser around the vessels. And again, that being lymphocytic. So this is an example of psoriasis. Case 10, so we have 3 levels of the same pieces. So again, what we see at low power, we have the same acanthosis with these papillae, these dermal papillae that are reaching up. And do we have parakeratosis? We do. Okay, so again, look at this beautiful, this is like perfect parakeratosis right here, where you can really see the levels, like how it's layered on top of each other, and this is confluent again. So I know some of it's missing here, but this is confluent parakeratosis. And we have these dilated vessels. Okay, they're not filled with red cells like our last case was, but these are dilated vessels. We do have red cell extravasation. And we have some neutrophils, maybe. Lymphocytes. Maybe a neutrophil there. It's kind of blurry when you're on high power in this case. Yeah, mostly lymphocytes. Let's see here. I'm looking for ants. Oh, there's one. This one looks like a Mickey Mouse. We've got the 2 ears and the face. So we do have neutrophils. And again, this is mostly lymphocytic. Hopefully you can appreciate that. Mostly these very small cells with very hyperchromatic nuclei. So again, this is an example of psoriasis. Case 11. So this really doesn't maybe look too distinct. It looks like we're missing some epidermis here. So these are not the same piece, 2 different pieces. And if we go in, what we actually see is like this is serum. We have absence of the epidermis, so this is an ulcer. And this is a good time to point out that erosions can involve any level of the epidermis, but an ulceration means complete epidermis involvement, okay? So this is an ulceration. So we definitely have neutrophils. Look at all the little ants in there. Much easier to see on this case than the previous two. We do have, what else? This doesn't look terribly acanthotic. The keratin layer actually looks relatively okay. We do have lymphocytes. I do see some eos in there. And there is, again, the solar elastosis to the superficial dermis. This is different, though. So here we have a Monroe microabscess or a neutrophilic microabscess. You can see all these little ants in there. Let's see what the other piece has for us. Even better. So again, we see these neutrophilic collections and this clefting, this subepidermal clefting and lifting of the epidermis. More of it here. But this looks a little different from like all our bullous lesions. And so what this is, if we go back here, this is dermatitis herpetiformis, and you can imagine because these lesions are so itchy that patients are prone to scratching at them. So likely what happened here is that this was really itchy and they scratched at it and they unroofed this area. So we had this excoriation here was that gave us this ulcerated area. So this is dermatitis herpetiformis. Case 12, again, these look very similar, but even at low power, we can make out these clefts. Okay, so we're just going to look at this one and kind of same thing. Okay, so we see that there are eosinophils. There are some neutrophils as well. So you can make out those little ants. There's this clefting, lots and lots of neutrophils and eos, and there's some red cell extravasation. And look at this beautiful, beautiful clefting with this basal neutrophilic collection. And then again, if you go into the dermis, you have kind of like this mixed inflammatory infiltrate, it's mostly perivascular. And you see how everything else is relatively normal. Like the epidermis itself is relatively normal. So this again is dermatitis herpetiformis. This is a different example, better clefting in this one. Case 13, well, here's our pathology right here. So we had this very large bulla, and it looks like there's a lot of cells in here. So that helps us feel confident that this is not just artifact. And if we go in, what we see is lots of disco balls or headphones, like over-the-ear headphones with these really red, granular, intensely eosinophilic cytoplasm. So these are eosinophils. Lots and lots of eosinophils. And we can see that the complete epidermal layer is lifted up. So you can imagine that if you did your IF, your IgG would light up here. Okay. This is an example of bullous pemphigoid. And again, so if we look at this, maybe this is the area that we're supposed to look at. So let's just go take a look at that. And it looks like we had some neutrophils. There are some eosinophils. And it looks again like our basal epidermal layer is intact. These are foamy macrophages. And that's okay. Let's take a look at the other piece. This is hard because this case is fragmented. That's what makes this case hard. But again, we have the complete unroofing, right? So here, your IgG on direct immunofluorescence would light up here. And we have a lot of eosinophils, sure, but we have even more neutrophils. Okay, eosinophils, neutrophils. And again, this is an example of bullous pemphigoid. Remember, there are examples that can be neutrophil predominant. And we have this relatively mild perivascular inflammation that is predominantly lymphocytic. There's like one EO there. Case 15. So this one, again, 2 levels. So you can see that like there's not as much epidermis on this one, but it's kind of hard to tell which piece you should be looking at. So we'll just start at the top one and work our way down. So again, we have this superficial lymphoplasmacytic infiltrate. Looks like we have some macrophages in there as well. There is some hyperkeratosis. And this is hair in here. So if anyone's wondering what this is, that's hair. And the granular layer on this case is a little more pink. It's more eosinophilic, so don't let that scare you. Okay, so we have something going on, and it's causing some sort of blister. And there we go. This is what we're looking for here. So here is our tombstoning, where it's just our basal layer that's intact, but we don't have any overlying epidermis. Let's see if we can find better examples in the other pieces. Again, this mostly looks like maybe artifactual split. Oh, this is a little better. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the epidermis again, but you can see like the basal keratinocytes, these are all intact. Okay, so as you have these areas where there's the cell and then nothing, and then we have the cell again, that's that tombstoning. So this is a case of pemphigus vulgaris. So let's see, we have one more piece. Maybe that will be a really good example for us. And this is why I like these cases for the challenges, because these are difficult. Yeah, so I think we already kind of saw the best of it. Oh, that's not terrible. You can see how it's clefting at the base. But this is pemphigus vulgaris. So again, if we go to case 16, doesn't look like we have too much going on. This is the largest piece, so let's focus on this and see what we have. Oh, great, this is much better. So again, we have this tombstoning effect where we can see that like even though this is tangential, here's your basal keratinocytes, and then we have liftoff with these other, with the rest of the epidermis. So again, the basal keratinocytes are intact and your superficial epidermis is lifted up. This is quite nice. And again, it's good to see these examples where it is tangential, where it's not perfectly set, because the reality is that you are likely to see cases that have at least some tangential sectioning. So you want to be aware of what that would look like, so that you're not surprised by it when you encounter it. And I do say when, not if, because tissue sometimes has a mind of its own when you're trying to embed it. Again, these basal keratinocytes are all intact, and we can see the epidermis, even though it's missing over here. We can imagine that it would look very similar to its counterparts over here. Other things that you should pay attention to. Like we do have spongiosis. So that spongiosis, again, being extremely common with this. You can see eosinophils as well within the dermis, but this looks mostly lymphocytic, which again is okay, because the direct immunofluorescence, or if you did like the serum IgG or ELISA or C3 with this. Remember, it has that sort of chicken wire pattern. And we can go back to that slide at the end of this just to kind of briefly go over that again. So this is another case of pemphigus vulgaris. Case 17, we are almost at the end. So what we notice is that there's a lot of inking on this case, but it's the exact same piece with multiple levels. So we're just going to go to the middle one. And what we see is kind of something to keep in mind when you have inked specimens is that this is ink tracking. So this space was already there. You can sometimes see that when spaces are artificial, but the ink tracked in. So this is not like melanocytic pigment that came in, because you can see the ink on the outside here, and it's the same coming in. We do have this vesicle or bullous space. There are increased melanocytes within the basal layer in this example, as we've seen in other examples. There is spongiosis, but within the bulla itself, there's really nothing. And it's kind of a little hard to make out if there's any real details, because it's just a little on the blurry side. It looks like there's also some actinic change or ciliary elastosis. Again, you can see like that blue-gray change in the superficial dermis. Not a lot of inflammation going on here. There's not a lot of much going on here besides this bulla, and that should be making you think of epidermolysis bullosa acquisita, or EBA, and that's what this is, where we have this paucicellular component, but otherwise it looks very similar to bullous pemphigoid. Our last case, case 18. So again, here we can, this is a little easier to tell than the last case because we don't have all that ink, but we have obvious pathology here. So here's the bulla. We have maybe a little bit of acanthosis, a little bit of hyperkeratosis. But within the bulla itself, there's some red cells and some scattered inflammation, but really nothing too exciting. This is, again, relatively paucicellular. Oh, and it's not loaded there at high power. And the dermis, again, oh, please load. There we go. Again, kind of has like this sort of actinic change or damaged look to the collagen, and there is this mild perivascular inflammation, but the bulla itself is relatively paucicellular, and this is another example again of epidermolysis bullosa acquisita. So that's your 18 cases. Let's just go back to that slide here where we talked about bullous pemphigoid having the roof for the IgG, whereas your epidermis bullosa. So again, like this would be the area where we had like those very few red cells, very few inflammatory cells. So EBA, and then we did see our dermatitis herpetiformis. So again, within these areas where you can imagine that there would be like this neutrophilic infiltrate with this clefting above, that's where you would have your IgA, and the chicken wire appearance to pemphigus vulgaris. So again, an IgG would do the same thing. So you can see either both IgG and C3 or either of them. And this would be your tombstoning area. Okay, so your basal keratinocytes retain their attachment to the dermis, and then that lift off of the epidermal cells. So that's the challenge cases for our dermatoses lecture. The video should be popping up about now for other videos in this series or our other series, as well as being able to subscribe if you aren't subscribed. And if you like this video, please hit like. If you have questions, please let us know in the comments below. Or again, you can send me messages on Twitter. And we hope to see you again at another slideshow. And if this goes well, then possibly at other challenge case reviews.